Samuel Fenwick, you're under arrest for arson. Put your hands behind your back.
Arson? I pulled a family out of that building. Check the footage.
The footage says what I need it to say. You mean what you altered? Careful, Firefighter. Accusations like that end careers. So does covering up a burglary ring, Chief.
The firehouse bay went silent as Kilgore forced Samuel's arms behind his back in front of his entire crew, ripping his fire department badge from his chest and tossing it onto the concrete floor. Samuel didn't fight the cuffs, didn't raise his voice, just stared straight into the chief's eyes with a calm that unsettled every officer watching. Firefighters who had trusted this man with their lives for 12 years stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Kilgore smiled as the cameras from the local news van rolled in, certain he had just buried the one man who could expose him. What Chief Kilgore didn't know was that State Internal Affairs had been recording his every move for the past 8 months, and this arrest was about to hand them the confession they needed. Comment where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe now, because tomorrow's story is one you can't afford to miss. The morning sun poured through the open bay doors of Firehouse 23, throwing long golden rectangles across the polished concrete floor, where Engine 7 sat gleaming after its weekly washdown. Samuel Fenwick stood near the truck's rear compartment, wearing his navy blue duty shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms and his charcoal gray work pants, checking the oxygen tanks with the same methodical care he'd shown for 12 years. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed against the backdrop of the skylight windows, creating that particular brightness that firehouses always seem to have, as if darkness wasn't allowed to settle in a place built to chase it away. Captain Marcus Doyle leaned against the doorframe of his office, coffee mug in hand, watching his best firefighter work. Doyle wore his own uniform pressed and sharp, the captain's bars catching the light. He'd known Samuel since they were both rookies. Back when the department felt smaller, more honest, 12 years of trust didn't just evaporate. It had weight, it had history. "You're quiet today," Doyle said. Samuel didn't look up from the tank valve, just thinking. About the Miller Street fire, Samuel's hands paused for half a second, then continued their work. About a lot of things. The other firefighters moved around the bay in their usual rhythm, checking equipment, joking about last night's game. The ordinary music of a working firehouse. Rookie Devon Marsh, no relation to anyone important, was polishing a helmet near the tool wall. 2 veteran firefighters, Big Ray Halston and Tommy Chen, were running diagnostics on the ladder truck. It was a day like any other, sunlight and routine, and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Then the sound of engines cut through the ordinary morning. 3 black and white cruisers pulling into the lot outside with a synchronized precision that felt less like routine patrol and more like a coordinated strike. Samuel looked up first. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a courtesy visit. Chief Bernard Kilgore stepped out of the lead cruiser, wearing his crisp white short-sleeve uniform shirt with the gold chief's insignia gleaming on the collar. His dark navy uniform pants creased to a knife's edge. He was flanked by 4 officers, 2 in short-sleeve summer patrol shirts and dark uniform pants, moving with the stiff purpose of men who'd been given specific instructions and warned not to deviate from them. Doyle set his coffee mug down slowly. "What is this?" Kilgore walked into the bay like he owned the concrete beneath his boots, his eyes locked on Samuel with a predator's certainty. The other firefighters stopped what they were doing, tools left mid-motion, conversations dying in their throats. Devon Marsh clutched the helmet to his chest like a shield. "Samuel Fenwick," Kilgore said, his voice carrying easily through the open bay, pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're under arrest for arson." The words hit the room like a dropped wrench. "Put your hands behind your back." Samuel set down the wrench in his hand with deliberate slowness. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He looked at Kilgore the way a man looks at a puzzle he's already solved. "Arson," Samuel said. "I pulled a family out of that building, checked the footage. The footage says what I need it to say." A ripple went through the crew. Ray Halston took a half step forward before Tommy Chen grabbed his arm, holding him back. Doyle's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the doorframe. Samuel's eyes never left Kilgore's face. "You mean what you altered?" Kilgore's expression flickered, just for a moment, a crack in the practiced authority. "Careful, firefighter, accusations like that end careers." "So does covering up a burglary ring, Chief." The bay went dead silent. Even the fluorescent hum overhead seemed to grow louder in the absence of any other sound. Kilgore's face hardened into something cold and final. He nodded to the 2 officers flanking him and they moved forward, grabbing Samuel's arms. Samuel didn't resist. He let them turn him, let them force his wrists together behind his back, his eyes still fixed on Kilgore, even as the cold metal of the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Kilgore reached forward and gripped the badge pinned to Samuel's chest, the one he'd worn with pride for over a decade, the one that had been pinned there the day Dolores stood beside him at his promotion ceremony with tears in her eyes. Kilgore ripped it free with a violent jerk, the fabric of Samuel's shirt tearing slightly at the seam, and he tossed the badge onto the concrete floor where it clattered and spun before settling near a drainage grate. The sound of metal on concrete echoed through the bay louder than it had any right to. "Chief, this is insane," Doyle said, stepping forward now, unable to hold himself back any longer. "Samuel Fenwick has saved more lives than any firefighter in this department's history. You cannot just walk in here and stand down, Captain," Kilgore snapped, not even looking at him, "unless you want obstruction charges added to your resume." Doyle's fists clenched at his sides, but he stopped, torn between duty and loyalty, between the uniform he wore and the man he'd called a brother for 12 years. The other firefighters stood frozen in place, disbelief carved into every face. This was a man who had crawled through collapsing ceilings to save strangers, who had given CPR to a child on the worst night of that family's life, who had trained half the rookies standing in this very bay. And now he stood in handcuffs, his badge lying discarded on the floor like garbage. Samuel felt the weight of their eyes on him, the stunned betrayal radiating off his crew like heat off asphalt. He understood their silence. He didn't blame them for it. What could they do against a police chief with 4 armed officers and a warrant, real or manufactured, in his hand? But he refused to let the humiliation break him. He thought of Dolores, her voice as clear in his memory as if she was standing beside him. "Truth outlasts lies, Samuel. It always does. It just takes its time getting there." He straightened his spine as much as the cuffs would allow and lifted his chin. "You think this ends anything?" Samuel said quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "You think arresting me makes it disappear?" Kilgore leaned in close, his voice dropping so only Samuel could hear it, though the proximity made it clear to everyone watching that something significant was being said. "I think you should have kept your mouth shut and your nose out of things that don't concern you. A family's stolen belongings concern me," Samuel replied just as quietly, "especially when the man who stole them wears a badge bigger than mine." Kilgore's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, something like fear flickered behind the practiced control. He straightened up quickly, covering the reaction with a tight, humorless smile. "Get him in the car," he barked to his officers. As they began walking Samuel toward the door, the distinct sound of a van pulling into the lot drew everyone's attention. A local news van, its satellite dish already extending upward, rolled to a stop near the cruisers. A reporter and cameraman jumped out with practiced speed, clearly having been tipped off in advance, clearly expecting exactly this moment. Kilgore's posture shifted immediately, straightening, chin lifting, the performance beginning the instant he sensed an audience. He placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, not gently, positioning him for the cameras like a trophy. "This is a significant arrest in an ongoing arson investigation," Kilgore announced to the reporter approaching with a microphone extended. "The department takes these matters extremely seriously, and I want to assure the community that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or reputation." The cameraman's lens swept across the scene, capturing Samuel's cuffed hands, his torn shirt, the badge still lying abandoned on the concrete. Samuel said nothing to the reporter, offered no soundbite, no reaction shot. He simply stood with that same unshakable calm, and somehow his silence unsettled Kilgore more than any accusation could have. Doyle watched from the doorway, his hands trembling with restrained fury, memorizing every detail, every officer's badge number, every second of this injustice unfolding in the place he'd spent his career trying to protect. Ray Halston had pulled out his phone, recording quietly from his hip, not wanting to draw attention, but unwilling to let this moment go undocumented. Devon Marsh stood frozen by the tool wall, tears welling in his eyes, still clutching the helmet like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had just tilted sideways. The officers guided Samuel toward the waiting cruiser, his head held high despite everything, his eyes finding Doyle's for one brief, waited moment. A silent exchange passed between them, an acknowledgement, a promise. "This isn't over." As the cruiser door shut behind Samuel, Kilgore turned back toward the cameras with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just eliminated a threat permanently. He believed the fire that had burned down that building had also burned away any evidence connecting him to the string of burglaries hidden inside impounded and condemned properties across the city. He believed Samuel Fenwick's testimony, his knowledge, his integrity could all be buried under fabricated charges and a compliant district attorney's office. What Kilgore did not know, could not have known, standing there in his crisp white shirt basking in the glow of local news coverage, was that 3 blocks away, in a nondescript government building with no signage indicating its true purpose, investigator Colleen Marsh sat in front of a bank of monitors, watching a live audio feed pulled from a wire concealed on Officer Trevor Aldridge, who had been standing quietly near the cruisers during the entire arrest. Marsh leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, a slow and grim smile crossing her face as Kilgore's voice played back through her headset. "Careful, firefighter, accusations like that end careers." She had spent 8 months building a case against Kilgore, collecting fragments of testimony, financial records, falsified reports. Whispers from officers too afraid to come forward directly. 8 months of patience, of watching, of the holding cell had no windows, but Samuel Fenwick's mind didn't need one. Under the buzzing fluorescent light of the precinct's intake block, he closed his eyes and let 12 years pull him backward like a current he no longer had the strength to resist. He saw himself at 29, standing in the sunlit bay of Engine House 14, wearing his crisp navy uniform shirt and matching navy trousers for the first time, the embroidered patch on his shoulder still stiff with newness. Captain Marcus Doyle, younger than 2, dark hair without the gray that now lived at his temples, had clapped him on the back so hard Samuel nearly stumbled. "You're going to be one of the good ones, Fenwick," Marcus had said. "I can smell it on you." Samuel had laughed that day. He remembered laughing a lot back then, before the world showed him how heavy truth could become when the wrong people didn't want to hear it. The memory that surfaced hardest, the one that always found him in moments of stillness, was the Alvarez house fire. 7 years ago, a 2-story colonial on Bishop Street, flames curling out of the second-floor windows like reaching hands, black smoke boiling into a bright blue sky. Samuel had gone in against protocol, against the shouted warnings of his crew, because a woman on the lawn was screaming that her children were still inside. He remembered the heat first, a wall of it that pressed against his turnout gear like a living thing. He remembered the low crawl through the hallway, one glove trailing the wall for guidance, lungs burning even through his mask. He found them in a closet. 2 boys, 6 and 8 years old, huddled together with a wet towel pressed over their faces, exactly as their mother had taught them. Samuel had carried the smaller one under his arm like a football and dragged the older boy by the collar of his shirt, moving through smoke so thick it swallowed the beam of his flashlight whole. When he emerged onto the lawn, soot-streaked and coughing, the mother had collapsed to her knees, screaming a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob, something ancient and grateful that lived beneath language. The local news had run the story for 3 days. Decorated firefighter Samuel Fenwick saves family from inferno. There had been a plaque, a commendation from the mayor's office. Marcus Doyle had pinned a new ribbon to his dress uniform himself, hands steady despite the wetness in his eyes. That family, the Alvarez family, would become the very foundation Chief Bernard Kilgore tried to bury him under. A different fire, years later, at a different address, but somehow their name would resurface in a falsified report claiming Samuel had returned to that same neighborhood to set ablaze for insurance money that was never his to collect. The lie was elegant in its cruelty. It took the truest thing Samuel had ever done and twisted it into a noose. Dolores Fenwick used to say that truth was patient. She said it the way other women said grace before dinner, like a ritual that fed something deeper than the stomach. "Truth doesn't rush, Samuel," she told him once, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea steaming between her palms while rain traced slow lines down the window behind her. "Lies are the ones always in a hurry. Truth just waits. It outlasts everything, because it doesn't have anywhere else to be." Dolores had been a school teacher for 22 years, the kind who remembered every student's birthday and kept a drawer of granola bars for the ones who came to class hungry. She had a laugh that filled a room without ever being loud, and she had loved Samuel with a steadiness that felt less like romance and more like gravity, an invisible force holding him to the ground when the world tried to spin him off it. She had been gone 3 years now. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late, gone too fast. Samuel still kept her reading glasses on the nightstand. He still reached for her side of the bed some mornings before his mind caught up to what his hand already knew. Their daughter Amara had inherited her mother's steel wrapped in her father's warmth. Amara Fenwick, 26 years old, in her final year of law school, wearing her favorite gray blazer over a cream blouse most days. Hair pulled back in a way that made her look like she was already arguing a case even when she was just crossing campus. She had her mother's sharp eyes and her father's stubborn hope, a combination that made her either brilliant or terrifying depending on which side of an argument you stood on. "You could have called me first," Amara had told Samuel once, months before the arrest, back when he first noticed something wrong at the impound lot. "Before you went to anybody in that department, you could have called me. You're still in school, baby," Samuel had said. "I didn't want to drag you into department politics." Amara had looked at him with an expression that mixed frustration and love in equal measure. "Dad, everything you find is already my business. I'm going to be a lawyer. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm training for." He hadn't listened, not because he doubted her, but because some part of him still saw her as the 6-year-old who used to fall asleep in the back seat of his truck on the way home from her mother's school events, small and trusting and entirely his responsibility to protect. He hadn't understood yet that protecting her would mean including her, not shielding her. The impound lot sat on the industrial edge of the city, a fenced acre of gravel and rust where seized vehicles and confiscated property waited in bureaucratic limbo under the flat gray sky of late autumn. Samuel had been called there on a follow-up inspection after a warehouse fire 3 lots over, checking for structural spread into the impound facility's storage sheds. That was where he found the crate. It sat behind Shed C, half-burned, the wood split open by heat and water damage, revealing what should not have been there. Jewelry boxes, silver picture frames, a collection of wristwatches still in velvet cases. None of it matched any inventory list posted on the shed's exterior clipboard. None of it had evidence tags. None of it made sense for property that was supposed to be seized vehicles and drug paraphernalia awaiting court disposal. Samuel had crouched beside the crate, sunlight breaking hard and clean through the gray clouds overhead, illuminating the scene with unforgiving clarity. He photographed everything on his phone, the way 12 years of training had taught him. Document first. Ask questions later. It was the serial numbers on 2 of the watches that made his stomach turn cold. He recognized them from a burglary report circulated department-wide just weeks earlier. A string of home invasions targeting the Fairview Heights neighborhood, wealthy homes, elderly residents, high-value items taken with unsettling precision. The department had called it professional, organized. They had never announced an arrest. Samuel had stood in that gravel lot for a long time, phone heavy in his hand, understanding slowly dawning like ash settling after a fire finally dies. Someone was using impounded and seized property as cover. Someone with authority to control what got logged, what got reported, what got quietly disappeared into evidence lockers that never saw a courtroom. He should have gone home first. He should have called Amara. He should have driven straight to Marcus Doyle's house and sat at his kitchen table and talked it through before doing anything else. Instead, trusting the badge he had worn with pride for over a decade, trusting the chain of command that had never failed him before. Samuel drove directly to the precinct and asked to speak with Deputy Chief Julian Ortega. Ortega's office had been cold that day, despite the overhead vents blowing steady warm air, decorated with commendation plaques and a framed photograph of Ortega shaking hands with the mayor. Ortega himself sat behind his desk in his long-sleeve dress uniform, gold buttons catching the fluorescent light, his expression unreadable as Samuel laid out what he'd found. "Show me the photos," Ortega had said, voice flat. Samuel had handed over his phone without hesitation. That was his mistake. Not the finding, not the reporting, but the trust that made him believe the chain of command existed to protect people like him instead of people like Kilgore. Ortega had scrolled through the images slowly, his jaw tightening by degrees so subtle Samuel almost missed it. "I'll take this to the chief personally," Ortega had finally said. "You did the right thing coming to me first, Fenwick. This stays between us for now, you understand, until we know how deep it goes." Samuel had left that office feeling something he now recognized as false relief, the particular calm of a man who believes the system will catch what it's designed to catch. He had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, Ortega would sit across from Chief Bernard Kilgore and describe exactly what Samuel had found, exactly what photos existed, exactly how much of a threat one honest firefighter had unknowingly become. He had no way of knowing that Kilgore's polished, easy smile at the department Christmas party 2 weeks later was the smile of a predator who had already begun planning how to remove him. Dolores had kept a leather journal for the last 4 years of her life, filling its pages with reflections, prayers, grocery lists, and fragments of wisdom she wanted Amara and Samuel to carry after she was gone. Samuel hadn't opened it in months, the grief still too sharp, but sitting now in a cold cell awaiting arraignment. He found himself remembering a passage she had read aloud to him once, her voice thin with illness but her conviction unshaken. When men build their houses on lies, she had read, the foundation always cracks eventually. It might take years, it might outlast the man who built it, but the ground remembers what was buried in it, Samuel. The ground always remembers. He hadn't understood then why those words felt important enough for her to underline twice in blue ink. He understood now, sitting in a cell with his firefighter's dignity stripped down to a county-issued jumpsuit, that Dolores had somehow always known truth required patience that felt indistinguishable from suffering. 12 years of trust, built one fire, one rescue, one honest report at a time, had been weaponized against him in a single afternoon. But Samuel closed his eyes under the buzzing lights and reached for the only inheritance that mattered now. His wife's unshaken certainty that the ground always remembered what was buried in it, and that even lies as carefully constructed as Kilgore's would eventually crack beneath their own dishonest weight. The holding cell smelled like bleach and old sweat, the fluorescent tubes overhead humming a steady electric note that never dimmed, never flickered, never let the eyes rest. Samuel Fenwick sat on the edge of the metal bunk, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped like a man in church who had run out of prayers but kept the posture anyway. He wore a gray short-sleeve county jumpsuit now, the fabric stiff against his skin, so different from his turnout gear that he almost didn't recognize his own arms beneath the sleeves. 12 years of hauling hose lines and carrying children out of smoke, and this was the uniform they gave him instead. Through the small reinforced window in the door, the corridor light spilled the same flat white it always did, morning or night, indistinguishable in this place. That was the cruelty of it, he thought. Fire had taught him to read light, to know dawn from dusk from the color of flame itself, orange meaning fuel, blue meaning heat, white meaning something had gone terribly wrong. But here there was only one light, and it told him nothing except that time was passing and he was still exactly where they'd put him. District Attorney Simone Carter had denied bail that morning, and Samuel didn't need anyone to explain why. He'd seen Kilgore's face in the arraignment room, seen the tight nod the chief gave Carter before she stood and made her recommendation to the judge. Flight risk, she'd said, a man with resources and motive to disappear. Samuel had almost laughed. He had $400 in his checking account and a mortgage he was 3 years from paying off. The only place he'd ever wanted to run to was home. He heard footsteps now, 2 sets, one heavy and official, one lighter and faster, almost running to keep pace. He knew that second set of footsteps the way he knew his own heartbeat. Fenwick, the guard said, working the lock. 15 minutes. Amara came through the door like a storm that had been building all night and finally found somewhere to break. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, the kind of outfit she'd started wearing to her law school moot court sessions, armor stitched from cotton and ambition. Her dark slacks were creased from sitting too long in waiting rooms. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and Samuel understood that she had cried already somewhere private and had refused to let this building see it. Daddy. She crossed the small space in 2 steps and gripped the bars separating them, her knuckles pale. I talked to 3 attorneys this morning. I talked to a judge's clerk. I've got calls into the State Bar Association. This is not going to stand, do you hear me? This is not going to stand. Amara. His voice came out rougher than he intended, 12 years of smoke damage finally showing itself. Sit down a second. I don't want to sit down, I want to get you out of here. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her forehead briefly against the cold bars before straightening again, composing herself the way he'd taught her, chin up, shoulders back, the way her mother used to do before walking into any room that doubted her. Chief Kilgore lied to a judge. He pressured the DA. I know he did, I can feel it. And nobody wants to say it out loud because everybody's scared of him. Samuel stood and closed the distance, wrapping his hands around hers where they gripped the bars, the metal warm now from her anger. I need you to hear me. Are you listening? She nodded, jaw tight. Being scared doesn't make people wrong to be scared. Kilgore's had that badge and that department in his pocket for years. Your mother used to say that men like him build their whole lives on other people's silence. You go out there swinging wild, you give him a reason to come after you too. I can't lose you to this, baby girl. I already know what losing feels like. Her eyes filled then, finally, the mention of her mother doing what the whole night in a cell couldn't. I'm not being reckless, Daddy. I'm being loud. There's a difference. I've already talked to a reporter at the Ledger. I'm organizing the guys from your academy class, the ones you trained with. We're going to be at every hearing, every arraignment, filling every seat in that courtroom so nobody can pretend this happened in the dark. Something in Samuel's chest loosened slightly, pride threading through the fear. This was Dolores in her, the fire that didn't need matches, that simply existed in the blood. That's good, that's smart. But you listen to your old man on this. Don't go at Kilgore directly, not yet. Let the truth build itself first. You go digging in the right places. What places? He hesitated, glancing at the small window in the door, then lowered his voice. Your mother kept things, papers, notes. You remember that box in the hall closet, the one with the brass lock she never let anybody touch? Amara's brow furrowed. The recipe box? Daddy, that's just her old handwritten recipes and church bulletins. Look again. Look at the back pages of her journal. The blue one with the frayed cover. She wrote things in there she never explained to me, not fully, something about a brass key and a folder. I always thought it was nothing, some old business from her volunteering at the courthouse records office. I want you to find that journal and read every page, every single one. Why now? Why does it matter now? Samuel's throat tightened. Because your mother told me once that truth doesn't disappear just because people stop looking at it. It waits. She used to say lies are loud, but they are hollow, and truth is quiet, but it's got weight. I think she was trying to tell me something back then, and I was too busy working doubles to listen close enough. I think she saw something coming. The guard rapped on the doorframe. 2 minutes. Amara's hands tightened around his. I'll find it. I promise you I'll find it. She pressed her forehead to his through the bars, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the fluorescent hum filling the silence between them like static. I love you, Samuel said. Your mother would be so proud of the woman fighting for me right now. She'd be prouder if I got you out. You will, not today, but you will. The guard's hand found her shoulder, gentle but final, and she leapt backward, eyes on him until the door swallowed her from view. Samuel sat back down on the bunk, and for the first time since the cuffs closed around his wrists in front of his crew, he let himself close his eyes and simply breathe. He thought of Dolores's journal sitting in that closet, untouched since her funeral 3 years ago, and wondered what he had missed. Brass key. A folder. His wife had spent years volunteering at the county records office, cataloging old case files nobody wanted to touch, and she'd come home some nights quiet in a way that used to worry him. He'd assumed it was fatigue. Now, sitting in a cell built by the very department she used to work adjacent to, he wondered if it had been something else entirely. Fear, maybe, or knowledge she didn't know how to carry alone. Across town, in the yellow brick firehouse that had been Samuel's second home for over a decade, Captain Marcus Doyle stood in the empty kitchen after the shift change, a legal pad in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. The overhead lights buzzed the same steady white as every other room in the city that day, indifferent to what was being decided beneath them. One by one, the crew filtered in. Rookie Deshaun Price first, still in his Navy work pants and department t-shirt, hands jammed in his pockets like he was trying to keep them from shaking. Then Ruiz, then old Pete Callahan, who'd been on the job almost as long as Marcus himself. They didn't need to be told why they'd been called together. They'd all stood in that bay and watched Kilgore rip the badge from Samuel's chest. I want to be straight with you, Marcus said, setting down his pen. Writing down what you saw yesterday could get you looked at sideways by half the department. Kilgore's got friends in places that matter, and this could follow you. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Deshaun spoke first, surprising everyone including himself. I saw Fenwick get arrested for something the whole crew knows he didn't do. I saw the footage they showed us doesn't match the timestamp from the truck's own dash cam. I'll write that down and sign my name to it. Callahan grunted in agreement, arms crossed over his broad chest. Man saved my nephew from a house fire on Kessler Street 4 years back. I'm not about to sit quiet while they bury him. Marcus looked around the room at the faces of men who had eaten 1,000 meals in this kitchen with Samuel, who had trusted him with their lives in burning buildings, and felt something steady settle into his own resolve. Then let's get it all down. Every detail, times, names, what the chief said, what we saw on the monitors before they cut the feed. We build this brick by brick, same as we'd fight any fire. Slow, careful, and together. Outside the firehouse windows, the afternoon sun poured down clean and bright, indifferent to the quiet rebellion assembling itself in that kitchen. Somewhere across the city, Samuel Fenwick sat beneath cell lights that never dimmed, holding onto his wife's memory and a mystery only she could have left behind. and somewhere else entirely, unseen by either of them yet, the machinery of justice that Colleen Marsh had spent 8 months building was beginning, at last, to turn. The State Internal Affairs Office occupied the 4th floor of a nondescript government building, its overhead fluorescent lights humming steadily against the gray afternoon visible through wide windows. Investigator Colleen Marsh sat at a corner desk cluttered with folders, her navy blazer draped over the back of her chair, a cream-colored blouse tucked into charcoal slacks. She had been awake since 4 that morning, and the coffee beside her had gone cold hours ago. On her monitor, paused mid-frame, was Chief Bernard Kilgore's face, caught in a grainy still from a hidden camera inside the 3rd Precinct evidence room. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. 6 months earlier. In the image, Kilgore's hand rested on a cardboard box marked with a burglary case number that had supposedly been closed and cleared. Colleen had watched this footage more times than she could count, and every time, the same cold clarity settled into her chest. This was not a man who occasionally bent rules. This was architecture, a system built brick by brick, badge by badge over years. She pulled up a spreadsheet she had maintained for 8 months, a document more valuable to her than her own service weapon. 31 impounded properties, 14 burglary cases marked closed with recovered stolen goods that, according to inventory logs, never made it back to their owners. 6 falsified fire reports that conveniently cleared buildings for demolition or resale after suspicious blazes. And at the center of it all, one name appearing again and again in property transfer documents, shell company filings, and evidence room sign-out sheets. Bernard Kilgore. Colleen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, studying the web of connections she had mapped across a corkboard mounted on the wall beside her desk. Red string-connected photographs, case numbers, and names. It looked like the wall of an obsessive, and in many ways she was exactly that. She had given 8 months of her life to this case, sacrificed weekends, missed her sister's wedding anniversary dinner, and endured the quiet suspicion of colleagues who didn't understand why an internal affairs investigator was so fixated on a police chief with a spotless public record and 3 commendations for community service. But Colleen had learned long ago that the men who received commendations were sometimes the same men who understood exactly how to manipulate the system that rewarded them. Her phone buzzed, a notification from the surveillance feed she had quietly maintained on local news coverage. She clicked the link and watched, not for the first time, the footage of Samuel Fenwick's arrest outside the firehouse. The cameras had captured everything. Kilgore's smug satisfaction. The badge hitting the concrete. Samuel's calm, unshaken face as the cuffs closed around his wrists. Colleen paused the video on a close-up of Samuel's expression. There was no fear there, no panic, just a quiet, immovable dignity that seemed almost otherworldly given the circumstances. She had seen men break under far less pressure than what Samuel Fenwick was enduring, but something in his eyes told her this man would not break, and more importantly, she understood something Kilgore himself did not yet realize. This arrest was a mistake, a desperate, reckless overreach. For 8 months, Kilgore had been careful, methodical. He had learned to keep his operation quiet, to work through intermediaries, to falsify just enough paperwork to make everything look procedurally clean. But Samuel Fenwick had gotten too close, had seen too much at that impound lot, and instead of finding a quiet way to discredit him or bury the evidence, Kilgore had panicked and made a public spectacle. He had arrested a decorated firefighter, a man with 12 years of unblemished service and a record of saving lives, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of an entire firehouse crew who would never believe the accusation. Colleen allowed herself a small, tight smile. Desperation made men sloppy, and sloppy men left trails. She minimized the news footage and opened a new file. Officer Trevor Aldridge, age 26, 4 years on the force, present at the scene of the fire that had supposedly proven Samuel Fenwick's guilt. According to the initial incident report, Aldridge had corroborated the chief's account of accelerant traces and suspicious behavior. But Colleen had spent enough time studying incident reports to recognize the particular flatness of language that came from an officer parroting someone else's words rather than his own observations. She had already run a quiet background check. Aldridge had no disciplinary history, no red flags, nothing that suggested he was complicit in anything beyond simply being young, inexperienced, and stationed under a chief who commanded absolute loyalty through fear and hierarchy. He was, in Colleen's professional assessment, exactly the kind of witness who could crack open a conspiracy from the inside, if she could reach him before Kilgore tightened his grip further. She picked up her desk phone, then reconsidered. Direct call to his precinct line would be logged, monitored, potentially flagged. Instead, she pulled out a burner phone she kept for exactly these situations and dialed a number she had obtained through a contact in the personnel office, a private cell line registered to Trevor Aldridge. The phone rang 3 times before a hesitant voice answered. "Hello, Officer Aldridge. My name is Colleen Marsh. I'm an investigator with the State Internal Affairs Division. I'd like to speak with you, off the record, about the Fenwick arson case." There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that Colleen wondered if he had hung up. "I don't think I'm supposed to talk about that without going through the chief's office," Aldridge finally said, his voice tight, careful. "I understand your hesitation," Colleen said, keeping her tone even measured. "But I want to be very clear with you, Officer Aldridge. This isn't a conversation that will go through the chief's office. This is a conversation that concerns the chief's office." Another pause, longer this time. Colleen could hear background noise, the low hum of a precinct. Footsteps, a distant printer. "I'm not saying anything until I know what this is about," Aldridge said finally. "Fair enough," Colleen replied. "I'll tell you what I can. I've been investigating Chief Kilgore for 8 months in connection with a burglary ring operating through impounded properties and falsified evidence reports. Samuel Fenwick discovered evidence connected to this operation. His arrest wasn't about arson, Officer Aldridge. It was about silencing a witness." Let him exhale sharply. "I need you to think back to that scene," Colleen continued. "The fire report you helped file. Did you personally observe accelerant traces, or were you told what the physical evidence would show before you arrived?" The silence stretched on so long that Colleen thought the call had dropped. When Aldridge finally spoke, his voice had changed, dropped lower, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I was told what we'd find before we got there," he admitted quietly. "The chief briefed us on scene, said it was already confirmed as arson from an earlier assessment. We just had to document what he described." Colleen closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the crack in the foundation. "Officer Aldridge, I want you to understand something," she said. "You are not in trouble, but you are in a position to help correct a profound injustice, and I believe you already know that. Or you wouldn't have hesitated before agreeing to talk to me. If I talk to you and this gets back to the chief, my career is over," Aldridge said, and Colleen could hear the genuine fear threading through his words. "Maybe worse than my career." "I understand the risk," Colleen said. "I won't pretend it isn't real, but I need you to understand something else. Chief Kilgore's operation is unraveling whether you participate or not. I have 8 months of surveillance, financial records, property transfers, and testimony beginning to accumulate against him. The question isn't whether he falls. The question is whether you want to be remembered as someone who told the truth when it mattered, or someone who stayed silent while an innocent man went to prison." She let the words sit in the silence between them, resisting the urge to fill the space, knowing that pressure applied too heavily would only make him retreat further. "I need time to think," Aldridge said finally. "Have some," Colleen replied, "but not much. I'd encourage you not to discuss this call with anyone at the precinct, including Deputy Chief Ordega, especially Deputy Chief Ordega." "Why especially him?" "Because I have reason to believe he's beginning to question his own loyalty to Kilgore," Colleen said. "And a man in that position, caught between guilt and self-preservation, is unpredictable. I don't want you caught in the crossfire of whatever he decides to do." Aldridge didn't respond immediately, and Colleen could imagine him standing somewhere in that precinct, gripping his phone, the weight of the conversation settling into his shoulders like a physical thing. "I'll call you back," he said finally, and the line went dead before Colleen could respond. She set the burner phone down and returned her attention to the corkboard, to the red string connecting names and dates and case numbers. Somewhere across the city, Bernard Kilgore was likely congratulating himself on a threat neutralized, believing that Samuel Fenwick's arrest had secured his position, had bought him silence and time. He had no idea that his own recklessness had accelerated the very collapse he was trying to prevent. He had no idea that a young officer with a conscience was standing at a crossroads that would determine everything. He had no idea that a woman he had never met, working quietly in a 4th-floor office under humming fluorescent lights, had spent 8 months constructing a case so thorough that his desperate gambit had simply handed her the final piece she needed. Colleen picked up her pen and added a new line to her file. "Trevor Aldridge, potential witness, status pending." Outside her window, the afternoon light remained bright and unforgiving, the kind of clear daylight that left nowhere to hide. She thought of Samuel Fenwick sitting in a holding cell, believing perhaps that the world had turned against him entirely. She thought of the quiet dignity she had seen in his eyes on that news footage. Soon, she thought, soon he would understand that somewhere in the machinery of justice, eyes had been watching all along, patient and unblinking, waiting for exactly this moment. She closed the file, gathered her folders, and began preparing for what she knew would be the most delicate phase of the entire operation. The walls around Bernard Kilgore were not yet visible to him, but they were closing, brick by brick, witness by witness, and there would be no reckless act, no public arrest, no display of power that could stop what was already in motion. The chief believed he had won. Colleen Marsh knew better. He was, in every way that mattered, already trapped. The break room at the 3rd Precinct smelled like burnt coffee and stale ambition, the kind of place where careers went to either harden or die. Officer Trevor Aldridge stood at the vending machine, his short-sleeved summer uniform shirt clinging slightly to his back in the artificial chill of the overhead air conditioning, the fluorescent lights above humming their same tuneless song they'd hummed for the 11 months he'd worked this building. He fed $1 into the machine and watched a bag of pretzels hang for a moment before dropping, and he thought about how that was exactly how he felt lately. Hanging, waiting to drop. He hadn't slept right in 4 days, not since the Fenwick arrest. He kept seeing it when he closed his eyes, Samuel Fenwick standing in that firehouse bay with his hands raised and his face calm, calmer than any guilty man had a right to be. Calmer than Trevor himself felt most mornings just pouring his cereal. He kept hearing Chief Kilgore's voice, sharp and triumphant, announcing the arrest to the cameras like he was reading off a scoreboard. And he kept remembering the arson scene itself, 3 weeks prior, the way the fire had eaten through that warehouse district building, the way the report had come back so fast, so clean, so certain. When Trevor himself had stood in the wreckage and seen things that didn't square with certain at all. He'd seen the accelerant pour patterns that didn't match a man like Fenwick, a decorated firefighter who would have known exactly how to disguise or exploit such things if he'd truly wanted to burn something down. He'd seen the busted lock on the side entrance that nobody photographed for the official file. He'd mentioned it once, carefully, to Deputy Chief Ordega, and Ordega had looked at him with an expression Trevor couldn't name at the time, but now understood perfectly. It was the look of a man deciding whether you were a problem. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from an unknown number. Asterisk coffee, corner of 9th and Vale, 20 minutes. Come alone. This is about the Fenwick case. Your conscience, not your career, is what matters here. Asterisk Trevor stared at it long enough that the pretzels grew cold in his hand. Colleen Marsh sat in the back booth of a diner 3 blocks outside the precinct's usual haunts, a place with checkered floors and a waitress who'd long stopped caring who came and went. She wore a charcoal blazer over a plain white blouse, unremarkable, forgettable, which was precisely the point. In front of her sat a manila folder, closed, patient, like a held breath. When Trevor Aldridge walked in, she recognized him instantly from the surveillance photos. Young, broad-shouldered in that gym-built way rookies often were, his summer uniform shirt pressed too carefully for a man who'd clearly slept in his car at some point this week. He hesitated at the door, scanning the room the way cops always did, and then he saw her and something in his shoulders sagged with something like relief and something like dread all at once. "Officer Aldridge," she said. "Not standing, sit down. I ordered you coffee. Black, I'm guessing, since you look like a man who doesn't have time for cream." He slid into the booth across from her, his eyes flicking to the folder. "Who are you?" "Colleen Marsh, State Internal Affairs." She let that sit for a moment, watching his face carefully, watching for the flicker of fear that told her whether this man was salvageable or already lost to the machine. What she saw instead was something rarer. Recognition. Like he'd been waiting for someone to finally say those words to him. "I figured it was something like that," Trevor said quietly. "You don't send cryptic texts about coffee unless you're either internal affairs or you're trying to get me fired. Maybe both, depending on how the next 10 minutes go." She opened the folder and slid the first photograph across the table. It was a still image, grainy but unmistakable, time-stamped 3 weeks prior. "Recognize this." Trevor looked down, his stomach dropped through the checkered floor. It was the warehouse fire scene, but it wasn't the angle from the official report. It was a wider shot, taken from a traffic camera 2 blocks away, showing the side entrance of the building a full 40 minutes before the fire department's records claimed Samuel Fenwick had even arrived on the property. "That's not possible," Trevor said, though even as the words left his mouth, He knew exactly how possible it was, because he'd wondered the same thing himself standing in the ash 3 weeks ago. It's not just possible, Officer Aldridge. It's time-stamped, verified, and corroborated by 2 additional traffic cameras with overlapping coverage. Samuel Fenwick's official arrival time, the one written into Chief Kilgore's report, has been altered. Someone changed the numbers. She slid a second photo across, this one of the busted side lock, sharp and clear. This is the entry point. You photographed this yourself. I have your original file timestamped from your body camera, officer. Then I have the official case file submitted 48 hours later, and this photograph is missing. Someone pulled it before submission. Trevor's hands had gone very still on the table. I want you to understand something, Marsh continued, her voice even patient, the voice of someone who had done this 100 times and knew that pushing too hard too fast broke fragile things. I'm not asking you to destroy your career today. I'm asking you to tell me what you saw, that's all. The truth of what your own eyes witnessed at that scene. If I talk to you, Trevor said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, and Kilgore finds out I'm done. Not just my job, I mean done. You understand how this works. You've been watching us for what, months? 8, she said simply. Then you know exactly how this works. His jaw tightened. Guys who cross Kilgore don't get fired quietly. They get reassigned to nothing precincts or written up for things that never happened or worse. There was an officer 2 years back, Danny Reyes, good cop, asked one too many questions about an evidence log. 6 months later, he's under investigation for planting drugs on a suspect that he never even arrested. Ruined, just like that. He snapped his fingers. You think Kilgore built all this by being careful with the people underneath him? I know exactly what Kilgore is capable of, Marsh said, and something in her tone made Trevor look up at her properly for the first time. There was steel there, banked but real. That's why I've spent 8 months building a case airtight enough that when it drops, there's no surviving it. Not for him, not for anyone who helped him, but I need people willing to stand inside the truth instead of hiding behind the fear of it. Samuel Fenwick is sitting in a holding cell right now for a crime he did not commit, Officer Aldridge. A decorated firefighter, a father, a man who has spent 12 years running into burning buildings to save strangers. And he is going to spend the rest of his life in prison unless people like you find the courage to say what they saw. The diner was quiet except for the hum of a ceiling fan and the distant clatter of the kitchen. Trevor stared down at the photographs, at his own boots visible in the corner of the frame from that day, at the version of himself who had stood in that wreckage and known, in his gut, that something was wrong, and had said nothing because saying something felt like stepping off a cliff. He looked me in the eye, Trevor said finally, quietly. Fenwick, the day of the arrest. Chief Kilgore had us all lined up in that bay, and Fenwick just looked at me, calm as anything, like he already knew how this was all going to end, not with fear, like he was disappointed in us, in me. He pressed his palms flat against the table. I've been a cop for 11 months. I took this job because my grandfather was a firefighter in Cleveland, and I grew up hearing stories about men like Fenwick, men who ran toward the fire instead of away from it. And I watched Kilgore drag one of them out in cuffs like a criminal, and I didn't say a word. Marsh let the silence hold. She had learned over the years that people convinced themselves faster in silence than in speeches. I'll testify, Trevor said at last, and the words seemed to cost him something physical, a weight visibly leaving his shoulders even as fear visibly settled into his eyes. Tell me what you need. I need everything, she said. Your body camera footage, unedited from that day. I need a sworn statement about the discrepancy in arrival times. I need you to think back on every conversation you've had with Chief Kilgore or Deputy Chief Ortega about this case, every instruction that felt off, every document you were told to hand over without question. Trevor nodded slowly, and then almost to himself he added, there's something else, something I haven't told anyone. Marsh went very still. Go on. 3 days before the fire, Kilgore had 2 units pulled off patrol rotation to handle, quote, a special assignment at the impound lot on Sutter Street. I was one of the officers reassigned. We were told to stand perimeter while unmarked trucks came and went. I never saw what was in them, but I remember thinking it was strange because impound lots don't usually need armed perimeter security for routine processing. He swallowed hard. I wrote it in my personal notes that night, not the official log. My own notes, because something about it bothered me enough that I wanted a record somewhere, even if it was just for myself. Marsh felt something settle into place inside her chest, the particular satisfaction of watching a scattered puzzle suddenly reveal its shape. I'm going to need those notes, Officer Aldridge. I'll bring them tomorrow. He looked at her then, really looked, searching her face for some guarantee she couldn't honestly give him. Will you protect me if this goes public? If Kilgore finds out I talked, I will do everything within my power, Marsh said. And I promise you this, the moment this case moves, it moves fast and it moves completely. Kilgore will not have time to retaliate against you individually because he will be far too occupied trying to save himself from the entire structure collapsing around him. Trevor exhaled a long breath, and for the first time since he'd walked into the diner, something like relief flickered across his features, thin and fragile but present. Back at the precinct, Deputy Chief Julian Ortega stood in his office with the door closed, staring at a stack of case files he had personally helped bury over the past 2 years, and felt, for the first time, the particular chill of a man realizing the ground beneath him had quietly turned to ice. It had started small. A phone call from a contact in the district attorney's office mentioning, almost casually, that state investigators had been requesting old impound lot records going back 18 months. Then a second call, this one less casual, from a friend in records who said someone from Internal Affairs had come by asking for surveillance footage sign-out logs, specifically footage from 3 weeks prior involving Officer Trevor Aldridge's assigned zone. Ortega had built his career on reading rooms before they spoke, and every instinct honed over 22 years on the force told him the room had already spoken loudly, and he simply hadn't been listening. He found Kilgore in his private office, sitting behind his desk, beneath a wall of commendations and photographs, the fluorescent overheads casting everything in that same flat, unforgiving light that made every face in the building look slightly guilty regardless of what they'd actually done. "We need to talk," Ortega said, closing the door behind him without waiting to be invited. Kilgore didn't look up from the paperwork in front of him. "I'm busy, Julian. Someone's pulling impound records, 18 months back, and someone's asking about Aldridge's footage from the Fenwick fire." That got Kilgore's attention. He set down his pen slowly, deliberately, way a man might set down a weapon he wasn't yet ready to admit he needed. "Who's asking? That's the problem. Nobody knows. Requests are coming through channels that don't leave clean trails. Whoever's doing this knows exactly how to move without tipping their hand." Ortega leaned forward, planting both hands on the desk. "Bernard, I've stood behind you on a lot of things. The impound lot arrangement, the reports, all of it. I told myself it was contained, controlled, that we knew every angle. But I don't like what I'm feeling right now. I don't like not knowing who's asking questions or how long they've been asking them." "You're spooked over paperwork requests," Kilgore said, though something in his voice had gone tighter, more clipped than usual. "Records get pulled all the time. Audits happen. It means nothing. It means something when it's happening at the same time we arrested Samuel Fenwick on evidence that you personally rushed through review." Ortega said, "It means something when the D.A.'s office is suddenly asking why we pressured them to deny bail on a first-time offense with no prior record. It means something when half the department is whispering about how fast that fire report came together, Bernard. Whispers travel. You know that better than anyone." Kilgore stood, moving to the window that overlooked the precinct parking lot. His reflection ghosted faintly against the glass beneath the harsh overhead light. Fenwick was a loose thread. He found something at the lot he shouldn't have seen, and he was foolish enough to report it up the chain instead of keeping his mouth shut. "I handled a problem, Julian. That's what I do. That's what I've always done to keep this operation and this department running smooth." "You didn't handle it," Ortega said, his voice rising despite himself. "You made it worse. You turned a firefighter with a spotless 12-year record into a public martyr, cuffed him in front of television cameras, and now his daughter is out there giving interviews to every reporter who'll listen, talking about her father's integrity, and people are starting to ask why a man with his record would suddenly commit arson with no discernible motive. You didn't remove a problem. You created a spotlight. And spotlights have a way of illuminating everything around them, including us." Kilgore turned from the window, his expression hardening into something colder than Ortega had seen from him in years. "Careful, Deputy Chief. You're speaking to me like a man who's already decided to jump ship. I'm speaking to you like a man who's watched you make increasingly reckless decisions for the past 3 weeks." Ortega shot back. The lot arrangement was supposed to stay quiet and profitable. Fenwick was supposed to be handled discreetly if he had to be handled at all. Instead, we've got a viral arrest, a state investigation sniffing around impound records, and an officer's personal footage suddenly of interest to people we can't identify. If this unravels, Bernard, it does not unravel gently. It takes down everyone who touched it. including me. And I did not sign on for that kind of exposure. The two men stared at each other beneath the fluorescent hum, the silence between them thick with something neither wanted to name directly. Loyalty, once assumed unbreakable, now visibly straining at its seams. "You need to trust me," Kilgore said finally, his voice quieter now, almost coaxing. "I have handled bigger fires than this. Fenwick stays where he is. The narrative stays controlled. We tighten what needs tightening. And this passes like everything else has passed." "And if it doesn't?" Ortega asked. "If this is different, if someone's been building something for months, waiting for exactly this kind of overreach." Kilgore didn't answer immediately, and that silence, more than anything he might have said, settled into Ortega's chest like a stone. "Find out who's pulling those records," Kilgore said finally, quietly. "I want a name by end of week. And if I can't get one, then we start considering who inside this building might be talking," Kilgore said, his eyes flat and cold beneath the overhead lights. "Starting with anyone who's shown even the slightest hesitation lately, including Aldridge. I don't like how quiet that kid's been the past few days." Ortega felt something twist uncomfortably in his gut at the mention of the young officer's name, an instinct he couldn't quite place. Some flicker of conscience he'd thought long buried beneath years of practical compromise. He said nothing about it, only nodded once, sharp and businesslike, and left the office without another word. Walking back down the hallway beneath the endless fluorescent glow, past officers going about their ordinary shifts, unaware of the storm gathering above their heads, Julian Ortega found himself, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, genuinely afraid. Not of exposure alone, afraid of what Kilgore might do to keep from being exposed. The morning light poured through the kitchen window of the Fenwick house, spilling gold across the worn linoleum, where Amara had spread her mother's belongings like pieces of a puzzle she refused to believe was unsolvable. 3 days had passed since her father's arraignment, 3 days of sleepless nights buried in law textbooks and her mother's handwriting, searching for something, anything, that might tip the scales. Amara wore a gray-fitted t-shirt and dark denim jeans. Her locks pulled back into a loose bun, reading glasses perched on her nose, though she rarely needed them, except when exhaustion blurred the words on the page. The journal lay open before her, its leather cover cracked with age, and she had read the passage so many times the words had started to feel like scripture. Asterisk, the brass key opens more than a box. It opens the truth I promised to keep safe for you, Samuel. When the day comes that you need it, you'll know. Asterisk, her mother had written those words nearly 6 years ago, months before the cancer took her, and Amara had always assumed it was metaphorical, some poetic turn of phrase Dolores favored when she wrote late at night with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside her. But now, with her father sitting in a holding cell and the walls of the case against him seeming to close tighter each day, Amara wondered if her mother had been more literal than anyone realized. She flipped back through the pages, searching for context, for a location, for anything that might tell her where such a key could be found. Her phone buzzed against the counter. Marcus Doyle. "Amara, you eating anything besides coffee grounds and desperation? Captain Doyle, I need you to come over. I think I found something." 40 minutes later, Marcus sat across from her at the kitchen table, still in his uniform. The navy short-sleeve shirt of the fire department stretched across broad shoulders that had carried more than his share of burden over the past week. His eyes, tired but alert, scanned the journal entry twice before he looked up. "A brass key," he said slowly. "Dolores mentioned where she kept it. Not directly, but look here." Amara turned to another page, one dated almost a year earlier than the first entry. She talks about a safety deposit box. Doesn't name the bank, but she mentions walking past the old clock tower to get there and depositing something for safekeeping. There's only one bank in this town with a clock tower view from the front steps. First National on Meridian. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Your father used to bank there before they moved everything to the credit union." "Exactly. And if she kept a box there, it would still be under her name unless someone closed it out after she passed." Amara's hands trembled slightly as she closed the journal. "Captain Doyle, I think my mother knew something. I think Dad told her things he never told anyone else, and she kept it hidden because she believed one day it would matter." Marcus reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over hers, steadying it. "Then we go find out." The drive to First National Bank felt longer than its actual 15 minutes, the city passing by in a blur of storefronts and stoplights, while Amara clutched the journal against her chest like a shield. The bank's exterior gleamed under the midday sun, its brick facade warmed to a deep amber, and the antique clock tower beside it chimed the noon hour as they climbed the front steps. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead, blending with the soft daylight filtering through tall windows, illuminating the marble floors and mahogany teller counters. Amara approached the customer service desk, where a woman in a crisp white blouse and black pencil skirt greeted her with practiced politeness. "I need to access a safety deposit box," Amara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It belonged to my mother, Dolores Fenwick. She passed away 6 years ago." The woman's expression softened with practiced sympathy as she typed the name into her computer. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me check our records." A pause, the clicking of keys, and then a small nod. "Yes, we do have a box under that name. It's still active. Someone has continued paying the annual fee." Amara's breath caught. "Who?" "According to our records. The payments have been automated from a linked account. It appears your father, Samuel Fenwick, has been maintaining it." Marcus glanced at Amara, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that Samuel had known, perhaps not everything, but enough to protect whatever his wife had hidden away. "I have his authorization as next of kin and executor of the estate," Amara said, producing the documents she'd brought just in case. Papers she'd filed months ago when settling her mother's affairs. "I need access to that box." The woman verified the paperwork, and within minutes, Amara and Marcus were led into the vault room, a chamber lined with steel boxes catching the overhead light in cold, metallic gleams. The attendant located box 214 and inserted the bank's master key, then stepped back for Amara to use hers. But Amara didn't have one, not yet. "Captain Doyle," she whispered, panic edging into her voice, "I never found the brass key. I don't know where my mother kept it." Marcus's brow furrowed, and then something shifted in his expression, memory surfacing like sediment stirred from a riverbed. "Dolores gave me something once," he said slowly. "Years ago, told me to keep it safe, said it was sentimental, a spare house key. I never thought twice about it." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small ring of keys he carried for the firehouse lockers, and among them, tarnished with age but unmistakably brass, hung a key that didn't belong to any locker Amara had ever seen. "She gave this to you," Amara's voice cracked. "Said if anything ever happened, and Samuel needed it, I'd know when." Tears blurred Amara's vision as she took the key from him, her fingers trembling as she fitted it into the lock. It turned smoothly, as though it had been waiting patiently for 6 long years for this exact moment. The box slid open, revealing a thick manila folder tied with twine, along with several photographs and a handwritten letter addressed simply to Samuel. Amara untied the twine with careful reverence, and the contents spilled gently onto the small table provided in the vault room. Photographs of the impound lot, taken from a distance, showing unmarked trucks unloading crates in the dead of night. Notes in her mother's handwriting, cross-referencing dates with Samuel's old fire department logs. Copies of receipts, property tags, and a list of names that included Chief Bernard Kilgore alongside several unfamiliar aliases. "She was building a case," Marcus whispered, disbelief coloring his voice. "All these years, she was documenting everything your father told her." Amara unfolded the letter, her mother's cursive handwriting looping across the page with the same warmth Amara remembered from childhood birthday cards and notes tucked into her school lunches. Asterisk, "My love, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally demanded to be told. I kept everything you shared with me because I believed you when you said something was wrong at that lot. I believed you when the world told you to stay quiet. Truth outlasts lies, Samuel. It always has. Give this to someone who will listen. Give it to someone who loves you enough to fight." Asterisk, Amara pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing quietly, the weight of her mother's foresight and faith settling over her like a long-overdue embrace. Marcus placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. "She knew," Amara whispered. "She knew this day would come. She trusted your father," Marcus said, "and she trusted you to finish what he started." Across town, in the cramped back office of Bishop's Pawn and Loan, Colleen Marsh sat across from Walter Bishop, a heavy-set man in his 60s wearing a faded flannel shirt and stained khaki trousers, his hands folded nervously atop a desk cluttered with old ledgers and dusty electronics. "Mr. Bishop, I'm not here to arrest you," Colleen said, her voice calm but firm, her badge resting visibly on the desk between them. "I'm here because I think you've been carrying a weight for a long time, and I think you're tired of carrying it alone." Walter's eyes darted toward the door, then back to her. "Kilgore's people come through here regular. Bring me things, tell me not to ask questions. I got a business to run, a family to feed. What was I supposed to do?" "You could keep quiet," Colleen said. "Or you could tell the truth and help put an end to something that's hurt a lot of people, including a good man sitting in a cell right now for something he didn't do. Walter's jaw tightened, decades of fear and complicity warring across his weathered face. Finally, he exhaled a long, shuddering breath. I got records, dates, serial numbers. Some of the stuff never made it through proper channels. Kilgore's boys would bring it in marked as recovered evidence, tell me to move it quiet like. Would you be willing to testify to that? Walter looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Man's been in this town longer than I have. Thinks nobody's got the spine to stand against him. Maybe it's time somebody proved him wrong. Colleen allowed herself the faintest smile, the first genuine one in months, as the net around Bernard Kilgore drew tighter, thread by thread, witness by witness, until there would be nowhere left for him to hide. The morning sun cut through the blinds of Chief Bernard Kilgore's office in sharp white lines, striping the carpet like prison bars he hadn't yet noticed closing around him. He stood behind his desk, wearing his long-sleeve dress uniform, the gold buttons catching the overhead fluorescent light that hummed steady above him, and his hands trembled as he fed documents into the shredder one by one. Property logs, impound release forms, a ledger with numbers that never should have existed on paper. The machine's grinding teeth chewed through 8 years of carefully hidden theft, but Kilgore knew, somewhere in the part of his mind he refused to listen to, that shredding paper couldn't shred memory, couldn't shred testimony, couldn't shred a woman's handwriting in a folder that had been sitting in a safety deposit box for 3 years, waiting. His phone buzzed against the desk. Deputy Chief Julian Ortega's name flashed on the screen, and Kilgore let it ring twice before answering. They're moving faster than we thought, Ortega said, his voice tight, clipped, a man walking on ice that had already started to crack beneath his boots. Carter's office called. They want a status update on the Fenwick prosecution by end of day. Then give them one, Kilgore snapped, pulling another folder toward the shredder. Tell them we're proceeding on schedule. Bernard. Ortega rarely used his first name. People are asking questions. Aldridge hasn't shown up for his last 2 shifts. Bishop's shop got a visit from state investigators yesterday. This isn't paranoia anymore. Kilgore's hand paused over the shredder's mouth. Handle your assignments, Julian. That's an order. He hung up before Ortega could respond, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk. Himself in dress blues shaking hands with the mayor 3 years ago. The picture of authority, of trust, of a badge that had opened every door in this city. Now he wondered how many of those doors were about to slam shut on him. Across town, in a courthouse conference room with tall windows letting in unfiltered daylight, District Attorney Simone Carter sat across from Kilgore, her navy blazer buttoned, her white blouse crisp beneath it. A legal pad in front of her covered in notes she hadn't shared. I need this expedited, Kilgore said, leaning forward, his forearms pressed against the table. The Fenwick case, I want an arraignment date locked in by Friday. Carter studied him for a long moment. She'd prosecuted enough men to recognize desperation when it sat across from her wearing a badge. Chief, I've reviewed the evidence file 3 times now. The surveillance footage timestamp doesn't align with the fire department's call log. Your arson investigator's report references a witness statement that doesn't exist in any file I've been given. Clerical errors happen. 4 of them in one case. Carter closed her folder, her eyes steady on his. I'm not fast-tracking anything until those discrepancies are resolved. Kilgore stood so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. You're going to let a decorated arsonist walk free because of paperwork. I'm going to make sure I'm not prosecuting an innocent man because a police chief wants a quick conviction. Carter's voice didn't rise, didn't waver. That's my job. Chief Kilgore, maybe you should remember what yours is supposed to be. He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway, each one sounding to him like a countdown. 3 miles away, in a converted office space with fluorescent panels buzzing overhead and caseboards covered in photographs, timelines, and red string connecting names to dates, Investigator Colleen Marsh stood before her assembled team. Her navy blazer hung over the back of a chair. Her white button-down sleeves rolled to her elbows, and the morning light streaming through the windows caught the determination hardening her face. Walter Bishop signed his statement an hour ago, she said, tapping a folder on the table. Full confession to receiving stolen property, names, dates, dollar amounts, all of it tracing back to inventory pulled from Kilgore's impound lot. Trevor Aldridge's sworn testimony corroborates the falsified fire report on the Fenwick case, and Dolores Fenwick's folder gives us photographic evidence dating back 3 years showing the same pattern of theft. She looked around the room at the 6 agents seated before her, each one in plain clothes, each one having spent months building toward this exact moment. Kilgore is destroying evidence as we speak. Ortega is one bad decision away from flipping. Move now or we lose the window. A young agent near the back raised his hand. Location, Marsh allowed herself the smallest, tightest smile. He's scheduled to appear at Firehouse 12 within the hour. Press conference about community relations. Damage control after Fenwick's arrest went public. She pulled her blazer back on, buttoning it with steady fingers. Same bay where he arrested Samuel Fenwick in front of cameras. We arrest him there. Same lighting. Same audience. Let the whole city watch the truth catch up to him. The Firehouse bay looked almost exactly as it had the day Samuel Fenwick was dragged out in handcuffs. The overhead fluorescents blazing bright against the concrete floor. The wide bay doors open to let in the midday sun. News vans had gathered outside once again, drawn by Kilgore's announcement of a press conference addressing what he called recent unfounded allegations against the department. Captain Marcus Doyle stood near the back of the assembled crew, his arms crossed over his Navy Department polo, his jaw tight. He'd gathered his firefighters here at Kilgore's request, told it was mandatory, and he hated every second of standing in this space again, remembering Samuel's calm face as they cuffed him. Amara Fenwick stood just outside the bay doors, her blazer and slacks sharp despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Having spent the morning filing motions and giving interviews, refusing to let her father's name fade from headlines. She'd come because word had reached her through Marcus that something was happening today, something bigger than another press conference. Kilgore stepped up to the small podium set up near the engine bay, his long sleeves pressed, his badge gleaming under the lights. He cleared his throat, scanning the cameras with the practiced confidence of a man who had stood in front of lenses 1,000 times before. Good afternoon. I want to address the concerns raised in recent days regarding the arrest of former firefighter Samuel Fenwick. The bay doors at the far end rolled open wider, sunlight pouring in around the silhouettes of a dozen figures walking in formation. Colleen Marsh led them, her badge held high, 4 state investigators flanking her, and behind them, 2 uniformed officers escorting a visibly shaken Deputy Chief Julian Ortega, his wrists already cuffed. The murmur that rippled through the crowd hit Kilgore like a physical blow. He turned from the podium, his composure cracking for the first time in years. What is this, Chief Bernard Kilgore? Marsh's voice carried clean and sharp across the bay, cutting through the stunned silence of firefighters, reporters, and onlookers. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy to commit grand theft, and falsifying official police reports. Cameras that had been rolling to capture his press statement now captured something else entirely, something no one in that bay would ever forget. This is insane. Kilgore's voice rose, cracking at the edges. I am the chief of police in this city. You don't have the authority. State Internal Affairs has full authority, and I've had a judge's signature on this warrant since 7 this morning. Marsh stepped closer, her team fanning out behind her. We have Walter Bishop's sworn statement identifying you as the operator of a burglary ring funneling stolen property through impounded vehicles and properties for the last 3 years. Gasps rippled through the gathered firefighters. Marcus Doyle's arms uncrossed slowly, his eyes widening as the pieces he'd suspected for weeks finally clicked into a devastating whole. You have Officer Trevor Aldridge's testimony confirming the arson report on the Fenwick case was falsified, that timestamps were altered, that a witness statement was fabricated to secure a conviction against an innocent man. Marsh's voice never wavered, never rose beyond what was needed. And we have 3 years of documentation compiled by Dolores Fenwick, correlating your impound records with reported burglaries across 17 separate incidents. Kilgore's face drained of color at the mention of Dolores's name. That's impossible. That woman's been dead for 2 years. Dead women can still tell the truth, Chief. Amara's voice rang out from the doorway, and every head turned toward her as she stepped into the bay, her eyes blazing, tears threatening but refusing to fall. My mother documented everything you did. Every stolen ring, every falsified log, every home you let your officers pick clean, she knew. And she made sure the truth would outlast you. The words hit the bay like a struck match, and Kilgore staggered back a step, his hand hitting the podium behind him. This is a coordinated attack, he said, but his voice had lost its command, thinning into something desperate. Marsh, you've been building a career off destroying good men. Good men don't burn buildings to bury evidence of their own crimes. Marsh said. Good men don't arrest an innocent firefighter in front of his crew to save themselves. Behind her, Julian Ortega finally spoke, his voice hollow, defeated. Tell them, Bernard. Tell them about the ledger. Tell them what you had me do with the Fenwick property records. Shut your mouth, Julian. I'm done. Ortega's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of two cuffed hands. I'm done covering for you. I have a family. I'm not going to prison protecting a man who is ready to let an innocent father rot for a crime you committed. The firehouse crew stood in stunned silence, watching the chief who had marched in here with such certainty now crumbling in real time, his authority dissolving under the weight of testimony stacking against him piece by piece, name by name. Marcus Doyle stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. You stood right here, he said, pointing at the exact spot where Samuel had been cuffed. Right here, and you ripped that man's badge off his chest. 12 years of service, 12 years of pulling people out of burning buildings, and you called him a criminal to save your own skin. Captain Doyle stepped back, one of Marsh's agents warned, but she raised a hand, letting him speak. I hope you rot, Marcus said, his voice shaking with a restrained fury he'd carried since the day of Samuel's arrest. I hope every single person you framed gets to look you in the eye someday. Kilgore's eyes darted around the bay, searching for an exit that didn't exist, for an ally who wouldn't meet his gaze, for any threat of the power he'd wielded so easily just moments before. There was none. Every officer present, every firefighter, every reporter, all of them watched him with the same expression Samuel Fenwick had worn during his own arrest weeks ago. Except where Samuel had carried dignity, Kilgore wore only exposure. Turn around, Chief, Marsh said quietly. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, the fight drained out of him, and Bernard Kilgore turned, placing his hands behind his back as an agent stepped forward with a fresh set of cuffs. The click of metal against his wrists echoed through the bay louder than any word spoken that day. Amara Fenwick stood frozen, watching the man who had destroyed her family's peace be led out through the same bay doors her father had been dragged through in humiliation. Marcus Doyle placed a steady hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the day of her father's arrest. Outside, as Kilgore was placed into the back of an unmarked car, cameras flashing around him, Colleen Marsh turned to face the gathered crowd, her voice steady enough to carry across the bay one final time. Samuel Fenwick will be released within the hour. All charges are being dropped. Effective immediately. The firehouse crew erupted into a mixture of stunned cheers and disbelieving relief, some crying, some embracing each other, the weight of the past weeks finally breaking apart like ice cracking under spring sun. Amara pressed a hand to her mouth, tears finally falling freely, and Marcus Doyle pulled her into a hug, his own eyes wet as he whispered the words he'd been waiting to say since the day this nightmare began. He's coming home. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and nervous sweat, overhead fluorescent lights humming steady across rows of wooden benches packed shoulder to shoulder. Samuel Fenwick sat at the defense table in a charcoal gray suit jacket and matching slacks, his hands folded in front of him, still as stone. Beside him, his attorney shuffled papers that no longer mattered. Behind him, Amara Fenwick sat in the front row wearing a navy blazer over a cream blouse, her spine straight. Her eyes fixed on District Attorney Simone Carter as she rose to address the judge. Your Honor, Simone said, her voice carrying clean through the room, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Samuel Fenwick, with prejudice. The words landed like a held breath finally released. Somewhere behind Samuel, a woman gasped, and he recognized the sound as Captain Marcus Doyle's wife, though he did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the judge. The way Dolores Fenwick had taught him to keep his eyes on what mattered and let the noise fall away. The state has received corroborating evidence, Simone continued, including testimony from Officer Trevor Aldridge, documentation recovered by investigator Colleen Marsh, and a sworn statement from Walter Bishop, confirming that the arson allegations against Mr. Fenwick were fabricated by former Chief Bernard Kilgore in an effort to obstruct an active investigation into a criminal enterprise operating within the police department. The judge, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose, looked over the rims at Samuel for a long moment. Mr. Fenwick, she said, this court apologizes for what you have endured. You are free to go, with the full restoration of your record. Samuel closed his eyes. He did not cry, not there, not in front of the cameras that had once broadcast his arrest to the entire city. But something in his chest loosened, some fist that had been clenched since the moment Kilgore ripped the badge from his shirt in the firehouse bay. He thought of Dolores, of her voice steady in his memory, telling him that truth was patient, that truth did not need to shout, because it always arrived exactly when it was needed. Amara was already moving, climbing over the low partition rail, wrapping her arms around her father's neck before the bailiff could even finish announcing the recess. "Daddy," she whispered into his shoulder, and he held her the way he used to hold her when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms, rocking gently, whispering that the storm always passed. Outside the courthouse, the sun sat high and bright over the marble steps, no shadows deep enough to hide in. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing. But Samuel walked through them with Amara's hand in his, calm, unhurried. The same dignity that had unnerved Kilgore months ago, now radiating outward, like proof of everything the badge had once meant. Captain Marcus Doyle stood at the bottom of the steps in his dress uniform, a long-sleeve navy jacket with silver buttons catching the sunlight, his cap tucked under his arm. When Samuel reached him, neither man spoke at first. They simply embraced, the kind of embrace between men who had pulled each other from burning buildings, who had trusted each other with their lives long before anyone tried to tear that trust apart. "Took them long enough," Marcus said finally, his voice thick. "Some things take exactly as long as they need to," Samuel answered, echoing words that were not entirely his own. 3 weeks later, in a different courtroom across town, Chief Bernard Kilgore stood as the verdict was read. He wore an ill-fitting suit now, gray and rumpled, nothing like the crisp long-sleeve uniform with its gleaming chief's insignia he had worn the day he arrested Samuel in front of cameras and crew. His face had lost its command. The confidence that once radiated from him now replaced with a hollow, cornered look. Guilty, racketeering, obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, conspiracy. The counts stacked one after another until the number itself became a kind of sentence. Beside him, Deputy Chief Julian Ortega received his own verdict moments later, his shoulders slumping under the weight of a betrayal he had once tried to bury by staying silent. He had wavered too long, chosen loyalty to a broken system over the truth that Colleen Marsh had been patiently assembling piece by piece for 8 months. Now that loyalty cost him everything. Colleen Marsh sat 2 rows back, arms crossed, expression unreadable but eyes sharp with quiet satisfaction. 8 months of surveillance, of careful footwork, of watching Kilgore's operation unravel one thread at a time, had finally reached its conclusion. She had never once doubted it would. Outside the courthouse, Officer Trevor Aldridge stood near the steps in his short-sleeved summer uniform, the fabric pressed and clean, his badge catching the overhead sun. He looked younger than his years standing there, the fear that had once gripped him in Colleen's private meeting now replaced by something steadier. He had testified. He had told the truth even when his hands shook on the witness stand, even when Kilgore's lawyer tried to twist his words. He had done it because Colleen had shown him evidence he could not unsee, and because somewhere beneath the fear, he had always known what was right. Walter Bishop, the pawnshop owner who had once trafficked stolen goods through Kilgore's network out of fear and greed in equal measure, had also testified, his voice trembling but clear. His cooperation had shaved years off his own potential sentence, but more than that, it had helped close the final gaps in the case. Redemption, it turned out, sometimes arrived through confession rather than silence. The firehouse looked the same as it always had, red brick walls, and a wide bay door rolled open to let in the afternoon light, fire engines gleaming under fluorescent tubes that never dimmed even with the sun pouring through the high windows. Samuel Fenwick stood at the threshold in civilian clothes, a simple white button-down shirt tucked into dark slacks, and for a moment he simply looked at the place that had been his second home for 12 years, the place where he had been humiliated and handcuffed in front of everyone he loved. Marcus Doyle walked toward him carrying something small wrapped in a cloth. The crew had gathered behind him, some in their work uniforms, navy short-sleeve shirts with the department patch on the shoulder, others still in their turnout gear from a call that had just come in. Amara stood off to the side near the engine, her arms crossed, tears already gathering though she was fighting them. "This belongs to you," Marcus said, unwrapping the cloth to reveal Samuel's badge, polished until it gleamed, the same badge that had been torn from his chest and thrown to the concrete like garbage. Samuel took it slowly, turning it over in his palm, feeling the weight of it settle into his hand like it had never left. 12 years, he murmured. 12 years and counting, Marcus corrected. Chief wants you back. Whole department wants you back. Hell, the mayor wants a photo with you, but I told him he'd have to get in line. A ripple of laughter moved through the crew, tension breaking like a held breath finally released. Samuel pinned the badge back onto his shirt himself, his fingers steady even though his heart pounded with something between grief and gratitude. He thought of Dolores then, the way he always did in moments that mattered most. He remembered her journal, the pages filled with her careful handwriting, the cryptic note about the brass key that had led Amara and Marcus to the safety deposit box, to the folder that had helped bring the whole rotten structure down. Dolores had never lived to see this day, but she had left behind exactly what he needed, a trail of truth stretching from her hands into the future she could not see, but somehow trusted would come. "She'd be proud of you," Amara said quietly, coming to stand beside him, reading the direction of his thoughts the way she always could. "She'd be proud of both of us," Samuel said, pulling her into his side. Later that afternoon, as the crew returned to their routines and the fire engines rumbled out for training drill, Samuel found Trevor Aldridge sitting alone on the back bumper of one of the trucks, still in his short-sleeve uniform, staring at his hands. "You did the hard part," Samuel said, sitting down beside him. Trevor looked up, surprised. "I almost didn't. I was scared." "Being scared and doing it anyway," Samuel said. "That's the only kind of courage that counts. The rest is just people who never had anything to lose." Trevor nodded slowly, something easing in his shoulders. "Chief Ortega used to tell us loyalty was everything. Guess he meant loyalty to him, not to what was right." "There's a difference between a badge and a man wearing it," Samuel said. "Don't ever let the badge tell you who you are. You tell the badge who you're going to be." Trevor studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Samuel shook it, firm and steady, and in that handshake was something larger than the two of them. A passing of something fragile and necessary from one generation to the next, trust rebuilding itself one honest conversation at a time. That evening, Samuel stood alone in his backyard as the sky shifted toward dusk, Dolores's journal open on the small table beside him, her handwriting catching the last light. He read her words one more time, the ones she had written years before any of this began. "Truth outlasts lies," she had written. "It may take its time, but it always arrives." He closed the journal gently and looked toward the house, where Amara's laughter drifted through an open window, where the porch light flickered on against the gathering dark, steady and warm and unafraid. The fire had tried to take everything from him. In the end, it had only revealed what could never be burned away. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.